This is a continuation of Now It Can Be Told by Philip Gibbs, comprising Part 5, Chapters 1 through 11.
Part 5. The Heart of a City. Amiens in Time of War. Part 5, Chapter 1. During the battles of the Somme in 1916, and afterward in periods of progress and retreat over the abominable fields, the city of Amiens was the capital of the British Army. When the battles began in July of that year, it was only a short distance away from the fighting lines, near enough to hear the incessant roar of gunfire on the French front and ours, and near enough to get, by motor car or lorry, in less than 30 minutes, to places where men were being killed or maimed or blinded in the routine of the day's work. One went out past Amiens station and across a little stone bridge which afterward, in the enemy's advance of 1918, became the mark for German high velocities along the road to Quereux, where Rawlinson had his headquarters of the Fourth Army in an old chateau with pleasant meadows round it and a stream meandering through fields of buttercups in summer-time. Beyond the dusty village of Quereux with its white cottages, from which the plaster fell off in blotches as the war went on, we went along the straight highroad to Albert, through the long and straggling village of La Haussoye, where Scottish soldiers in reserve lounged about among frowsy peasant women and played solemn games with the bairns, and so, past camps and hutments on each side of the road, to the ugly red brick town where the Golden Virgin hung head downward from the broken tower of the church, with her babe outstretched above the fields of death, as though as a peace offering to this world at war. One could be killed any day in Albert. I saw men blown to bits there, the clay after the battles of the Somme began. It was in the road that turned to the right, past the square to go to Motot and on to Fricourt. There was a tide of gun transport swirling down the road, bringing up new ammunition for the guns that were firing without a pause over Fricourt and Mametz. The high scream of a shell came through a blue sky and ended on its downward note with a sharp crash. For a few minutes the transport column was held up while a mass of raw flesh, which a second before had been two living men and their horses, was cleared out of the way. Then the gun wagons went at a harder pace down the road, raising a cloud of white dust, out of which I heard the curses of the drivers, swearing in a foul way to disguise their fear. I went through Albert many scores of times to the battlefields beyond, and watched its process of disintegration through those years, until it was nothing but a wild scrap heap of red brick and twisted iron, and in the last phase, even the Golden Virgin and her bab, which had seemed to escape all shell fire by miraculous powers, lay buried beneath a mass of masonry. Beyond were the battlefields of the Somme, where every yard of ground is part of the great graveyard of our youth. So Amiens, as I have said, was not far away from the red heart of war, and was clear enough to the lines to be crowded always with officers and men who came out between one battle and another, and by lorry jumping could reach this city for a few hours of civilized life, according to their views of civilization. To these men, boys, mostly who had been living in lousy ditches under hell fire, Amiens was paradise, with little hells for those who liked them. There were hotels in which they could go get a bath, if they waited long enough or had the luck to be early on the list. There were streets of shops with plate glass windows unbroken, shining, beautiful. There were well-dressed women walking about with kind eyes and children as dainty, some of them, as in High Street, Kensington, or Prince's Street, Edinburgh. Young officers who had plenty of money to spend because there was no chance of spending money between a row of blasted trees and a ditch in which bits of dead men were plastered into the parapet, invaded the shops and bought fancy soaps, razors, hair oil, stationery, pocketbooks, knives, flash lamps, top boots at a fabulous price, khaki shirts and collars, gramophone records, and the latest set of Kirtner prints. It was the delight of spending, rather than the joy of possessing, which made them go from one shop to another in search of things they could carry hack to the line, that, and the lure of girls behind the counters, laughing, bright-eyed girls who understood their execrable French, even English spoken with a Glasgow accent, and were pleased to flirt for 5 minutes with any group of young fighting men who broke into roars of laughter at the gallantry of some Don Juan mum with the gift of audacity, and paid outrageous prices for the privilege of stammering out some foolish sentiment in broken French, blushing to the roots of their hair, though captains and heroes, at their own temerity with a girl who, in another 5 minutes, would play the same part in the same scene with a different group of boys. I used to marvel at the patience of these girls. How bored they must have been with all this flirtation, which led to nothing except, perhaps, the purchase of a bit of soap at twice its proper price. They knew that these boys would leave to go back to the trenches in a few hours, and that some of them would certainly be dead in a few days. There could be no romantic episode, save of a transient kind, between them and these good-looking lads in whose eyes there were desire and hunger, because to them the plainest girl was womanhood, the sweet, gentle, and feminine side of life, as opposed to the cruelty, brutality, and ugliness of war and death. The shop girls of Amiens had no illusions. They had lived too long in war not to know the realities. They knew the risks of transient love, and they were not taking them unless conditions were very favorable. They attended strictly to business and hoped to make a lot of money in the shop, and were, I think, mostly good girls, as virtuous as life in wartime may let girls be wise beyond their years, and with pity behind their laughter for these soldiers who tried to touch their hands over the counters, knowing that many of them were doomed to die for France and England. They had their own lovers' boys in blue somewhere between Vaux-sur-Somme and Hartmanns, while a Kopfen, apart from occasional intimacies with English officers quartered in Amiens for long spells, left the traffic of passion to other women who walked the streets. Part 5, Chapter 2. The street of the Three Pebbles, La Rue des Trois Queloax, which goes up from the station through the heart of Amiens, was the crowded highway. Here were the best shops, the hairdresser. At the left-hand side, where all day long officers down from the line came in to have elaborate luxury in the way of close crops with friction deo de quinine, shampooing, singeing, oiling, not because of vanity, but because of the joyous sense of cleanliness and perfume after the filth and stench of life in the desolate fields. Then the booksellers, Madame Carpentier et Phil, on the right-hand side, which was not only the rendezvous of the miscellaneous crowd buying stationery and la vie parisienne, but of the intellectuals who spoke good French and bought good books, and liked 10 minutes' chat with the mother and daughter. Madame was an Alsatian lady with vivid memories of 1870, when, as a child, she had first learned to hate Germans. She hated them now with a fresh, vital hatred, and would have seen her own son dead 100 times. He was a soldier in Saloniki, rather than that France should make a compromise peace with the enemy. She had been in Amiens, as I was, on a dreadful night of August of 1914, when the French army passed through in retreat from Bapaume, and she and the people of her city met the first time that the Germans were close upon them. She stood in the crowd as I did in the darkness, watching that French column pass with their transport, and their wounded lying on the baggage wagons, men of many regiments mixed up, the light of the street lamps shining on the casques of cuirassiers with their long horsehair tails, leading their stumbling horses, and foot soldiers, hunched under their packs, marching silently with dragging steps. Once in a while one of the soldiers left the ranks and came onto the sidewalk, whispering to a group of dark shadows. The crowds watched silently, in a curious, dreadful silence, as though stunned. A woman near me spoke in a low voice, and said, "Nous sommes perdus." Those were the only words I heard or remembered. That night in the station of Amiens the boys of a new class were being hurried away in truck trains, and while their army was in retreat sang La Marseillaise, as though victory were in their hearts. Next day the German army under von Kluck entered Amiens, and 10 days afterward passed through it on the way to Paris. Madame Carpentier told me of the first terror of the people when the field-grey men came down the street of the Three Pebbles and entered their shops. A boy selling oranges fainted when a German stretched out his hand to buy some. Women hid behind their counters when German boots stamped into their shops. But Madame Carpentier was not afraid. She knew the Germans and their language. She spoke frank words to German officers, who saluted her respectfully enough. "You will never get to Paris. France and England will be too strong for you. Germany will be destroyed before this war ends." They laughed at her and said, "We shall be in Paris in a week from now. Have you a little diary, madame?" Madame Carpentier was haughty with them. Some women of Amiens, poor drabs, did not show any haughtiness, nor any pride, with the enemy who crowded into the city on their way toward Paris. A girl told me that she was looking through the window of a house that faced the Place de la Guerre, and saw a number of German soldiers dancing round a piano organ which was playing to them. They were dancing with women of the town, who were laughing and screeching in the embrace of big, blonde Germans. The girl who was watching was only a schoolgirl then. She knew very little of the evil of life, but enough to know that there was something in this scene degrading to womanhood and to France. She turned from the window and flung herself on her bed and wept bitterly. I used to call in at the bookshop for a chat now and then with Madame and Mademoiselle Carpentier, while a crowd of officers came in and out. Madame was always merry and bright in spite of her denunciations of the sailboches, les brigands, les bandits. And Mademoiselle put my knowledge of French to a severe but pleasant test. She spoke with alarming rapidity, her words tumbling over one another in a cascade of volubility delightful to hear but difficult to follow. She had a strong mind, masterly in her methods of business, so that she could serve 6 customers at once and make each one think that her attention was entirely devoted to his needs, and a very shrewd and critical idea of military strategy and organization. She had but a poor opinion of British generals and generalship, although wholehearted admiration for the gallantry of British officers and men, and she had an intimate knowledge of our preparations, plans, failures, and losses. French liaison officers confided to her the secrets of the British Army, and English officers trusted her with many revelations of things in the wind. But Mademoiselle Carpentier had discretion and loyalty, and did not repeat these things to people who had no right to know. She would have been far more efficient as a staff officer than many of the young gentlemen with red tabs on their tunics who came into the shop, flipping beautiful top boots with riding crops, sitting on the counter and turning over the pages of La Vie for the latest convention in ladies' legs. Mademoiselle was a serious musician, so her mother told me, but her musical studies were seriously interrupted by business and air raids, which one day ceased in Amiens altogether after a night of horror, when hundreds of houses were smashed to dust and many people killed, and the Germans brought their guns close to the city, close enough to scatter high velocities about its streets, and the population came up out of their cellars, shaken by the terror of the night, and fled. I passed the bookshop where Mademoiselle was locking up the door of this house, which had escaped by greater luck than its neighbors. She turned as I passed and raised her hand with a grave gesture of resignation and courage. "Ils n'y passeront pas," she said. It was the spirit of the courage of French womanhood which spoke in those words. Part 5, Chapter 3. That was in the last phase of the war, but the Street of the Three Pebbles had been tramped up and down for 2 years before then by the British armies on the Somme, with the French on their right. I was never tired of watching those crowds and getting into the midst of them and studying their types. All the types of young English manhood came down this street, and some of their faces showed the strain and agony of war, especially toward the end of the Somme battles, after 4 months or more of slaughter. I saw boys with a kind of hunted look in their eyes, and death was the hunter. They stared into the shop windows in a dazed way, or strode along with packs on their backs, looking neither to the right nor to the left, and white, haggard faces, as expressionless as masks. Tomorrow or the next day perhaps the hunter would track them down. Other English officers showed no sign at all of apprehension or lack of nerve control, although the psychologist would have detected disorder of soul in the rather deliberate note of hilarity with which they greeted their friends in gusts of laughter, for no apparent cause, at Charlie's bar, where they would drink 3 cocktails apiece on an empty stomach, and in their tendency to tell tales of horror as things that were very funny, they dined and wined in Amiens at the Rhine, the Godard, or the Cathedral, with a kind of spiritual exaltation in good food and drink, as though subconsciously they believed that this might be their last dinner in life, with good pals about them. They wanted to make the best of it and damn the price. In that spirit many of them went, after other pleasures, down the byways of the city, and damned the price again, which was a hellish one. Who blames them? It was war that was to blame, and those who made war possible. Down the Rue des Trois Cailloux, up and down, went English, and Scottish, and Irish, and Welsh, and Canadian, and Australian, and New Zealand fighting men. In the winter they wore their trench coats all splashed, and caked up to the shoulders with the white, chalky mud of the Somme battlefields, and their top boots and puttees were plastered with this mud, and their faces were smeared with it after a lorry drive or a tramp down from the line. The rain beat with a metallic tattoo on their steel hats. Their packs were all sodden. French poilers, detrained at Amiens station for a night on their way to some other part of the front, jostled among British soldiers, and their packs were a wonder to see. They were like travelling tinkers, with pots and pans and boots slung about their faded blue coats, and packs bulging with all the primitive needs of life in the desert of the battlefields beyond civilization. They were unshaven, and wore their steel casques low over their foreheads, without gaiety, without the means of buying a little false hilarity, but grim and sullen-looking and resentful of English soldiers walking or talking with French cocottes. Part 5, Chapter 4. I saw a scene with a French poiler one day in the Street of the Three Pebbles during those battles of the Somme, when the French troops were fighting on our right from Maricourt southward toward Roye. It was like a scene from Gaspard. The poilu was a middle-aged man, and very drunk on some foul spirit, which he had bought in a low cafe down by the river. In the high street he was noisy, and cursed God for having allowed the war to happen, and the French government for having sentenced him and all poor sacred poilus to rot to death in the trenches, away from their wives and children, without a thought for them, and nothing but treachery in Paris. Nous sommes traitors, said the man, raising his arms, for the 100th time France is betrayed. A crowd gathered round him, listening to his drunken denunciations. No one laughed. They stared at him with a kind of pitying wonderment. An agent de police pushed his way between the people and caught hold of the soldier by the wrist and tried to drag him away. The crowd murmured a protest, and then suddenly the poilu, finding himself in the hands of the police, on this one day out of the trenches after 5 months, flung himself on the pavement in a passion of tears and supplication. Je suis père de famille, je suis un soldat de France. Dans les tranchées pour 5 mois. Qu'est-ce que mes camarades vont dire, crénom de dire. Et mon capitaine, si est mordant après toute ma service comme brave soldat, mais quoi donc mon vieux? Viens donc saligord, growled the agent de police. The crowd was against the policeman. Their murmurs rose to violent protest on behalf of the poilu. Si est un heros tout de même, cinq mois dans les tranches, si est sol, mais il est sol, mais pourquoi pas? Après 5 mois sur le front, qu'est-ce que signifie? California n'a aucune importance. A dandy French officer of chasseurs alpines stepped into the center of the scene and tapped the policeman on the shoulder. Leave him alone. Don't you see he is a soldier? Sacred name of God, don't you know that a man like this has helped to save France, while you pigs stand at street corners watching petticoats? He stooped to the fallen man and helped him to stand straight. Be off with you, mon brave, or there will be trouble for you. He beckoned to 2 of his own chasseurs and said, Look after that poor comrade yonder. He is un peu étoile. The crowd applauded. Their sympathy was all for the drunken soldier of France. Part 5, Chapter 5. Into a small estaminet at the end of the Rue des Trois Cailloux, beyond the Hotel de Ville, came one day during the battles of the Somme 2 poilus, grizzled, heavy men, deeply bronzed, with white dust in their wrinkles, and the earth of the battlefields ingrained in the skin of their big, coarse hands. They ordered 2 little glasses and drank them at one gulp. Then 2 more. See what I have got, my little cabbage, said one of them, stooping to the heavy pack which he had shifted from his shoulders to the other seat beside him. It is something to make you laugh. And what is that, my old one? Said a woman sitting on the other side of the marble-top table with another woman of her own class, from the market nearby. The man did not answer the question, but fumbled into his pack, laughing a little in a self-satisfied way. I killed a German to get it, he said. He was a pig of an officer, a dirty Boche. Very chic, too, and young like a schoolboy. One of the women patted him on the shoulder. Her eyes glistened. Did you slit his throat, the dirty dog? I'd like to get my fingers round the neck of a dirty Boche. I finished him with a grenade, said the poilu. It was good enough. It knocked a hole in him as large as a cemetery. See then, my cabbage. It will make you smile. It is a funny kind of mascot, eh? He put on the table a small leather pouch stained with a blotch of reddish-brown. His big, clumsy fingers could hardly undo the little clasp. He wore this next his heart, said the man. Perhaps he thought it would bring him luck, but I killed him all the same. Crénom de Dieu. He undid the clasp, and his big fingers poked inside the flap of the pouch. It was from his woman, his German Gru. Perhaps even now she doesn't know he's dead. She thinks of him wearing this next to his heart. Crénom de Dieu. It was I that killed him a week ago. He held up something in his hand, and the light through the estaminet window gleamed on it. It was a woman's lock of hair, like fine-spun gold. The 2 women gave a shrill cry of surprise, and then screamed with laughter. One of them tried to grab the hair, but the poilu held it high, beyond her reach, with a gruff command of hands off. Other soldiers and women in the estaminet gathered round staring at the yellow tress, laughing, making ribald conjectures as to the character of the woman from whose head it had come. They agreed that she was fat and ugly, like all German women, and a foul slut. She'll never kiss that fellow again, said one man. Our old one has cut the throat of that pig of a Boche. I'd like to cut off all her hair and tear the clothes off her back, said one of the women. the dirty drab with yellow hair. They ought to be killed, every one of them, so that the human race should buy rid of them. Her lover is a bit of clay anyhow, said the other woman. A bit of dirt, as our poilus will do for all of them. The soldier with the woman's hair in his hand stroked it across his forefinger. All the same it is pretty. Like gold. I think of the woman sometimes, with blue eyes like a German girl I kissed in Paris, a dancing girl. There was a howl of laughter from the two women. The old one is drunk. He is amorous with the German cow. I will keep it as a mascot, said the poilu, scrunching it up and thrusting it into his pouch. It'll keep me in mind of that saligold of a German officer I killed. He was a chic fellow, tout de mime. A boy. Part 5. Chapter 6. Australians slouched up the street of the Three Pebbles with a grim look under their wide-brimmed hats, having come down from Posieres, where it was always hell in the days of the Somme fighting. I liked the look of them, dusty up to the eyes in summer, muddy up to their eyes in winter, these gypsy fellows, scornful of discipline for discipline's sake, but desperate fighters, as simple as children in their ways of thought and speech, except for frightful oaths, and looking at life, this life of war, and this life in Amiens, with frank, curious eyes, and a kind of humorous contempt for death, and disease, and English Tommies, and French girls, and the whole damned show, as they called it. They were lawless except for the laws to which their souls gave allegiance. They behaved as the equals of all men, giving no respect to generals or staff officers or the devils of hell. There was a primitive spirit of manhood in them, and they took what they wanted, and were ready to pay for it in coin or in disease or in wounds. They had no conceit of themselves in a little, vain way, but they reckoned themselves the only fighting men, simply and without boasting. They were hard as steel and finely tempered. Some of them were ruffians, but most of them were, I imagine, like those English yeomen who came into France with the Black Prince, men who lived rough, close to nature, of sturdy independence, good-humored, though fierce in a fight, and ruthless. That is how they seemed to me in a general way, though among them were boys of a more delicate fibre and sensitive, if one might judge by their clear-cut features and wistful eyes. They had money to spend beyond the dreams of our poor Tommy, 6 shillings and 6pence a day, and remittances from home. So they pushed open the doors of any restaurant in Amiens and sat down to table next to English officers, not abashed, and ordered anything that pleased their taste, and wine in plenty. In that high street of Amiens one day I saw a crowd gathered round an Australian so tall that he towered over all other heads. It was at the corner of the Rue de Cour nous sans test, the street of the naked body without a head, and I suspected trouble. As I pressed on the edge of the crowd I heard the Australian ask, in a loud, slow drawl, whether there was any officer about who could speak French. He asked the question gravely, but without anxiety. I pushed through the crowd and said, I speak French. What's the trouble? I saw then that, like the French poilu I have described, this tall Australian was in the grasp of a French agent de police, a small man of whom he took no more notice than if a fly had settled on his wrist. The Australian was not drunk. I could see that he had just drunk enough to make his brain very clear and solemn. He explained the matter deliberately, with a slow choice of words, as though giving evidence of high matters before a court. It appeared that he had gone into the estaminet opposite with 4 friends. They had ordered 5 glasses of Porto, for which they had paid 20 centimes each, and drank them. They then ordered 5 more glasses of Porto and paid the same price, and drank them. After this they took a stroll up and down the street, and were bored, and went into the estaminet again, and ordered 5 more glasses of Porto. It was then the trouble began. But it was not the Australian who began it. It was the woman behind the bar. She served 5 glasses more of Porto, and asked for 30 centimes each. 20 centimes, said the Australian. Vingt, madame. Mais non, 20 centimes chaque verre. 30, my old one. 6 sauce comprenez? No comprenia, said the Australian. Vingt centimes, or go to hell. The woman demanded the 30 centimes, kept on demanding with a voice more shrill. It was her voice that vexed me, said the Australian. That and the bloody injustice. The 5 Australians drank the 5 glasses of Porto, and the tall Australian paid the 30 centimes each without further argument. Life is too short for argument. Then, without words, he took each of the 5 glasses, broke it at the stem, and dropped it over the counter. You will see, sir, he said, gravely, the justice of the matter on my side. But when they left the estaminet, the woman came shrieking into the street after them. Hence the agent de police and the grasp on the Australian's wrist. "I should be glad if you would explain the case to this little Frenchman," said the soldier. "If he does not take his hand off my wrist, I shall have to kill him." "Perhaps a little explanation might serve," I said. I spoke to the agent de police at some length, describing the incident in the cafe. I took the view that the lady was wrong in increasing the price so rapidly. The agent agreed gravely. I then pointed out that the Australian was a very large-sized man, and that in spite of his quietude he was a man in the habit of killing Germans. He also had a curious dislike of policemen. "It appears to me," I said politely, "that for the sake of your health the other end of the street is better than this." The agent de police released his grip from the Australian's wrist and saluted me. "Vous avez raison, monsieur. Je vous remercie. Ces Australiens sont vraiment formidables, n'est-ce pas?" He disappeared through the crowd, who were smiling with a keen sense of understanding. Only the lady of the estaminet was unappeased. "They are bandits, these Australians," she said to the world about her. The tall Australian shook hands with me in a comradely way. "Thanks for your trouble," he said. "It was the injustice I couldn't stick. I always pay the right price. I come from Australia." I watched him go slouching down the Rue des Trois Cailloux, head above all the passers-by. He would be at Posier's again next day. Part 5, Chapter 7. I was billeted for a time with other war correspondents in an old house in the Rue Admiral Courbet, on the way to the river Somme from the Street of the Three Pebbles, and with a view of the spire of the cathedral, a wonderful thing of delicate lines and tracery, graven with love in every line, by Muirhead Bone and from my dormer window. It was the house of me, de la Rochefoucauld, who lived farther out of the town, but drove in now and then to look at this little mansion of hers at the end of a courtyard behind wrought iron gates. It was built in the days before the Revolution, when it was dangerous to be a fine lady with the name of Rochefoucauld. The furniture was rather scanty, and was of the Louis Quinze and Empire periods. Some portraits of old gentlemen and ladies of France, with one young fellow in a scarlet coat, who might have been in the King's Company of the Guard, about the time when Wolfe scaled the heights of Abraham, summoned up the ghosts of the house, and I liked to think of them in these rooms and going in their sedan chairs across the little courtyard to high mass at the cathedral or to a game of bezique in some other mansion, still standing in the quiet streets of Amiens, and less in a day in March of 1918. They were destroyed with many hundreds of houses by bombs and gunfire. My little room was on the floor below the garret, and here at night, after a long day in the fields up by Posieres or Martinpuich, or beyond, by Ligny-Tilloy, on the way to Bapaume, in the long struggle and slaughter over every inch of ground, I used to write my day's dispatch, to be taken next day. It was before we were allowed to use the military wires, by King's messenger to England. Those articles, written at high speed, with an impressionism born out of many new memories of tragic and heroic scenes, were interrupted sometimes by air bombardments. Hostile airmen came often to Amiens during the Somme fighting, to unload their bombs as near to the station as they could guess, which was not often very near. Generally they killed a few women and children and knocked a few poor houses and a shop or two into a wild rubbish heap of bricks and timber. While I wrote, listening to the crashing of glass and the anti-aircraft fire of French guns from the citadel, I used to wonder subconsciously whether I should suddenly be hurled into chaos at the end of an unfinished sentence, and now and again, in spite of my desperate conflict with time to get my message done, the censors were waiting for it downstairs. I had to get up and walk into the passage to listen to the infernal noise in the dark city of Amiens. But I went back again and bent over my paper, concentrating on the picture of war which I was trying to set down, so that the world might see and understand, until once again, 10 minutes later or so, my willpower would weaken, and the little devil of fear would creep up to my heart, and I would go uneasily to the door again to listen. Then once more to my writing. Nothing touched the house in the Rue Admiral Courbet while we were there. But it was into my bedroom that a shell went crashing after that night in March, when Amiens was badly wrecked, and we listened to the noise of destruction all around us from a room in the Hotel du Rhin on the other side of the way. I should have been sleeping still if I had slept that night in my little old bedroom when the shell paid a visit. There were no lights allowed at night in Amiens, and when I think of darkness I think of that city in time of war, when all the streets were black tunnels, and one fumbled one's way timidly, if one had no flash lamp, between the old houses with their pointed gables, coming into sharp collision sometimes with other wayfarers. But up to midnight there were little lights flashing for a second, and then going out. Along the Street of the Three Pebbles, and in the dark corners of side streets. They were carried by girls seeking to entice English officers on their way to their billets, and they clustered like glowworms about the side door of the Hotel du Rhin after 9 o'clock, and outside the railings of the public gardens. As one passed, the bright bull's eye from a pocket torch flashed in one's eyes, and in the radiance of it one saw a girl's face, laughing, coming very close, while her fingers felt for one's badge. "How dark it is tonight, little captain. Are you not afraid of darkness? I am full of fear. It is so sad, this war, so dismal. It is comradeship that helps one now. A little love, a little laughter, and then who knows?" A little love, a little laughter, alluring words to boys out of one battle, expecting another, hating it all, lonely in their souls because of the thought of death, in exile from their own folk, in exile from all womanhood and tender, feminine things, up there in the ditches and shell craters of the desert fields, or in the huts of headquarters staffs, or in reserve camps behind the fighting line. A little love, a little laughter, and then who knows? The sirens had whispered their own thoughts. They had translated into pretty French the temptation of all the little devils in their souls. Un peu d'amour. One flash lamp was enough for 2 down a narrow street toward the riverside, and then up a little dark stairway to a lamp-lit room. Presently this poor boy would be stricken with disease and wish himself dead. Part 5, Chapter 8. In the Street of the Three Pebbles, there was a small estaminet, into which I went one morning for a cup of coffee, while I read an Amiens news sheet, made up mostly of extracts translated from the leading articles of English papers. There was never any news of French fighting beyond the official communique and imaginary articles of a romantic kind written by French journalists in Paris about episodes of war. In one corner of the estaminet was a group of bourgeois gentlemen talking business for a time, and then listening to a monologue from the woman behind the counter. I could not catch many words of the conversation, owing to the general chatter, but when the man went out, the woman and I were left alone together, and she came over to me and put a photograph down on the table before me, and, as though carrying on her previous train of thought, said, in French, of course, "Yes, that is what the war has done to me." I could not guess her meaning. Looking at the photograph, I saw it was of a young girl in evening dress with her hair coiled in an artistic way and a little curl on each cheek. Madame's daughter, I thought, looking up at the woman standing in front of me in a grubby bodice and tousled hair. She looked a woman of about 40, with a wan face and beaten eyes. "A charming young lady," I said, glancing again at the portrait. The woman repeated her last sentence, word for word. "Yes, that is what the war has done to me." I looked up at her again and saw that she had the face of the young girl in the photograph, but coarsened, aged, raddled by the passing years and perhaps by tragedy. "It is you?" I asked. "Yes, in 1913, before the war. I have changed since then, n'est-ce pas, monsieur?" "There is a change," I said. I tried not to express my thought of how much change. "You have suffered in the war more than most people." "Ah, I have suffered." She told me her story, and word for word, if I could have written it down then, it would have read like a little novel by Guy de Maupassant. She was the daughter of people in Lille, well-to-do merchants, and before the war married a young man of the same town, the son of other manufacturers. They had 2 children and were very happy. Then the war came. The enemy drove down through Belgium and one day drew near and threatened Lille. The parents of the young couple said, "We will stay. We are too old to leave our home, and it is better to keep watch over the factory. You must go with the little ones, and there is no time to lose." There was no time to lose. The trains were crowded with fugitives and soldiers, mostly soldiers. It was necessary to walk. Weeping, the young husband and wife said farewell to their parents and set out on the long trail, with the 2 babies in a perambulator, under a load of bread and wine, and a little maid carrying some clothes in a bundle. For days they tramped the roads until they were all dusty and bedraggled and footsore, but glad to be getting farther away from that tide of field grey men which had now swamped over Lille. The young husband comforted his wife. "Courage," he said. "I have money enough to carry us through the war. We will set up a little shop somewhere." The maid wept bitterly now and then, but the young husband said, "We will take care of you, Margot. There is nothing to fear. We are lucky in our escape." He was a delicate fellow, rejected for military service, but brave. They came to Amiens and hired the estaminet and set up business. There was a heavy debt to work off for capital and expenses before they would make money, but they were doing well. The mother was happy with her children, and the little maid had dried her tears. Then one day the young husband went away with the little maid and all the money, leaving his wife in the estaminet with a big debt to pay and a broken heart. "That is what the war has done to me," she said again, picking up the photograph of the girl in the evening frock with a little curl on each cheek. "Si est triste, madame." "Oui, si est triste, monsieur." But it was not war that had caused her tragedy, except that it had unloosened the roots of her family life. Guy de Maupassant would have given just such an ending to his story. Part 5, Chapter 9. Some of our officers stationed in Amiens and billeted in private houses became very friendly with the families who received them. Young girls of good middle class, the daughters of shopkeepers and schoolmasters, and merchants in a good way of business, found it delightful to wait on handsome young Englishmen, to teach them French, to take walks with them, and to arrange musical evenings with other girl friends who brought their young officers and sang little old French songs with them, or English songs in the prettiest French accent. These young officers of ours found the home life very charming. It broke the monotony of exile and made them forget the evil side of war. They paid little gallantries to the girls, bought them boxes of chocolate until fancy chocolate was forbidden in France, and presented flowers to decorate the table, and wrote amusing verses in their autograph albums or drew sketches for them. As this went on, they gained to the privilege of brotherhood, and there were kisses before saying good night outside bedroom doors, while the parents downstairs were not too watchful, knowing the ways of young people, and lenient because of their happiness. Then a day came in each one of these households when the officer billeted there was ordered away to some other place. What tears, what lamentations, and what promises never to forget little Jeanne with her dark tresses, or Suzanne with the merry eyes. Were they not engaged? Not formally, perhaps, but in honor and in love. For a time letters arrived, eagerly waited for by girls with aching hearts. Then picture postcards with a line or two of affectionate greeting. Then nothing. Nothing at all, month after month, in spite of all the letters addressed with all the queer initials for military units. So it happened again and again, until bitterness crept into girls' hearts, and hardness and contempt. "In my own little circle of friends," said a lady of Amiens, "I know 18 girls who were engaged to English officers and have been forsaken. It is not fair. It is not good. Your English young men seem so serious, far more serious than our French boys. They have a look of shyness which we find delightful. They are timid at first and blush when one pays a pretty compliment. They are a long time before they take liberties. So we trust them and take them seriously, and allow intimacies which we should refuse to French boys, unless formally engaged. But it is all camouflage. At heart your English young men are just flirts. They play with us, make fools of us, steal our hearts, and then go away, and often do not send so much as a postcard. Not even one little postcard to the girls who weep their hearts out for them. You English are all hypocrites. You boast that you play the game. I know your phrase. It is untrue. You play with good girls as though they were grooves, and that no Frenchman would dare to do. He knows the difference between good girls and bad girls, and behaves with reverence to those who are good. When the English army goes away from France, it will leave many bitter memories because of that." Part 5, Chapter 10. It was my habit to go out at night for a walk through Amiens before going to bed, and generally turned riverward, for even on moonless nights there was always a luminance over the water, and one could see to walk along the quayside. Northward and eastward the sky was quivering with flashes of white light, like summer lightning, and now and then there was a long, vivid glare of red touching the high clouds with rosy feathers. One of our dumps, or one of the enemy's, had been blown up by that gunfire, sullen and menacing, which never ceased for years. In that quiet half hour, alone or with some comrade, like Frederick Palmer or Beach Thomas, as tired and as thoughtful as oneself after a long day's journeying in the swirl of war, one's brain roved over the scenes of battle, visualizing anew, and in imagination, the agony up there, the death which was being done by those guns, and the stupendous sum of all this conflict. We saw, after all, only one patch of the battlefields of the world, and yet were staggered by the immensity of its massacre, by the endless streams of wounded, and by the growth of those little forests of white crosses behind the fighting lines. We knew, and could see at any moment in the mind's eye, even in the darkness of an Amiens night, the vastness of the human energy which was in motion along all the roads to Paris, and from Boulogne and Dieppe and Havre to the fighting lines, and in every village on the way the long columns of motor lorries bringing up food and ammunition, the trains on their way to the army railheads with material of war, and more food and more shells, the Red Cross trains crowded with maimed and injured boys, the ambulances clearing the casualty stations, the troops marching forward from back roads to the front, from which many would never come marching back, the guns and limbers and military transports and spare horses, along hundreds of miles of roads, all the machinery of slaughter on the move. It was staggering in its enormity, in its detail, and in its activity. Yet beyond our sphere in the British section of the Western Front there was the French front, larger than ours, stretching right through France, and all their roads were crowded with the same traffic, and all their towns and villages were stirred by the same activity and for the same purpose of death, and all their hospitals were crammed with the wreckage of youth. On the other side of the lines the Germans were busy in the same way, as busy as soldier ants, and the roads behind their front were cumbered by endless columns of transport and marching men and guns and ambulances laden with bashed, blinded, and bleeding boys. So it was in Italy, in Austria, in Saloniki, and Bulgaria, Serbia, Mesopotamia, Egypt. In the silence of Amiens by night, under the stars, with a cool breath of the night air on our foreheads, with a glamour of light over the waters of the Somme, our spirit was stricken by the thought of this world tragedy and cried out in anguish against this bloody crime in which all humanity was involved. The senselessness of it, the futility, the waste, the mockery of men's faith in God. Often Palmer and I, dear, grave old Palmer, with sphinx-like face and honest soul, used to trudge along silently, with just a sigh now and then, or a groan, or a sudden cry of, "Oh God, oh Christ." It was I, generally, who spoke those words, and Palmer would say, "Yes, and it's going to last a long time yet." A long time, it's a question who will hold out 24 hours longer than the other side. France is tired, more tired than any of us. Will she break first? Somehow I think not. They are wonderful. Their women have a gallant spirit. How good it is, the smell of the trees tonight. Sometimes we would cross the river and look back at the cathedral, high and beautiful above the huddle of old houses on the quayside, with a faint light on its pinnacle and buttresses and immense blackness beyond them. Those builders of France love their work, said Palmer. There was always war about the walls of this cathedral, but they went on with it, stone by stone, without hurry. We stood there in a long silence, not on one night only, but many times, and out of those little dark streets below the Cathedral of Amiens came the spirit of history, to teach our spirit with wonderment at the nobility and the brutality of men, and their incurable folly, and their patience with tyranny. When is it all going to end, Palmer, old man? The war or the folly of men? The war. This cursed war. This bloody war. Something will break one day on our side or the other. Those who hold out longest and have the best reserves of manpower. We were starting early next day before dawn to see the beginning of another battle. We walked slowly over the little iron bridge again, through the vegetable market, where old men and women were unloading cabbages from a big wagon, then into the dark tunnel of the Rue des Augustins, and so to the little old mansion of Mame de la Rochefoucauld in the Rue Amiral Courbet. There was a light burning in the window of the censor's room. In there the colonel was reading the Times in the Louis Quinze salon, with a grave pucker on his high, thin forehead. He could not get any grasp of the world's events. There was an attack on the censor by Northcliffe. Now what did he mean by that? It was really very unkind of him, after so much civility to him. Charteris would be furious. He would bang the telephone, but dear, why should people be so violent? War correspondents were violent on the slightest provocation. The world itself was very violent, and it was all so dangerous. Don't you think so, Russell? The cars were ordered for 5 o'clock. Time for bed. Part 5, Chapter 11. The night in Amiens was dark and sinister when rain fell heavily out of a moonless sky. Hardly a torch lamp flashed out except where a solitary woman scurried down the wet streets to lonely rooms. There were no British officers strolling about. They had turned in early, to hot baths and unaccustomed beds, except for one or two, with their Burberrys buttoned tight at the throat, and sopping field caps pulled down about the ears, and top boots which went splash, splash through deep puddles, as they staggered a little uncertainly, and peered up at dark corners to find their whereabouts, by a dim sense of locality and the shapes of the houses. The rain pattered sharply on the pavements and beat a tattoo on leaden gutters and slate roofs. Every window was shuttered, and no light gleamed through. On such a night I went out with Beach Thomas as often before, wet or fine after hard writing. "A foul night," said Thomas, setting off in his quick, jerky step. "I like to feel the rain on my face." We turned down as usual to the river. It was very dark. The rain was heavy on the quayside, where there was a group of people bareheaded in the rain and chattering in French, with gusts of laughter. "Une bouteille de champagne." The words were spoken in a clear boy's voice, with an elaborate caricature of French accent in musical cadence, but unmistakably English. "A drunken officer," said Thomas. "Poor devil." We drew near among the people and saw a young officer arm in arm, with a French peasant, one of the market porters, telling a tale in broken French to the audience about him, with comic gesticulations and extraordinary volubility. A woman put her hand on my shoulder and spoke in French. "He has drunk too much bad wine. His legs walk away from him. He will be in trouble, monsieur." And a child no older than my own boy, who is fighting in the Argonne. "Apportez-moi une bouteille de champagne, vite," said the young officer. Then he waved his arm and said, "J'ai perdu mon cheval." A kingdom for a bloody horse, as Shakespeare said. "Y a-t-il quelque qui a vu mon sacre cheval?" In other words, if I don't find that four-legged beast, which led to my damnation, I shall be shot at dawn. Fusil, comprenez. On va me fusiler par un mur blanc, or is it une mur blanche? Quand elle aurore, s'élève avec les choulots d'une rose et l'odd d'une fileve et parfumée. Pretty good that. Eh, what? But the fact remains that unless I find my steed, my charger, my warhorse, which in reality does not belong to me at all, because I pinched it from the colonel, I shall be shot as sure as fate. And, alas, I do not want to die. I am too young to die, and meanwhile I desire encore une bouteille de champagne. The little crowd of citizens found a grim humor in this speech, 1/3 of which they understood. They laughed coarsely, and a man said, "Quel drôle de type. Quel numero." But the woman who had touched me on the sleeve spoke to me again. "He says he has lost his horse and will be shot as a deserter." Those things happen. My boy in the Argonne tells me that a comrade of his was shot for hiding 5 days with his young woman. It would be sad if this poor child should be condemned to death. I pushed my way through the crowd and went up to the officer. "Can I help at all?" He greeted me warmly, as though he had known me for years. "My dear old pal, you can indeed. First of all, I want a bottle of champagne, une bouteille de champagne." It was wonderful how much music he put into those words. And after that, I want my runaway horse, as I have explained to these good people who do not understand a bloody word, in spite of my excellent French accent. I stole the colonel's horse to come for a joyride to Amiens. The colonel is one of the best of men, but very touchy indeed. You would be surprised. He also has the worst horse in the world, or did, until it ran away half an hour ago into the blackness of this hell, which men call Amiens. It is quite certain that if I go back without that horse, most unpleasant things will happen to a gallant young British officer, meaning myself, who with most innocent intentions of cleansing his soul from the filth of battle, from the horror of battle, from the disgusting fear of battle, oh yes, I've been afraid all right. And so have you, unless you're a damned hero, or a damned liar desired to get as far as this beautiful city, so fair without, so foul within, in order to drink a bottle, or even 2 or 3, of rich, sparkling wine, to see the loveliness of women as they trip about these pestilential streets, to say a little prayer in La Cathedral, and then to ride back, refreshed, virtuous, nightly, all through the quiet night, to deliver up the horse whence I had pinched it, and nobody any the wiser in the dewy morn. You see, it was a good scheme. "What happened?" I asked. "It happened thuswise," he answered, breaking out into fresh eloquence, with fantastic similes and expressions of which I can give only the spirit. "Leaving a posieres, which, as you doubtless know, unless you are a bloody staff officer, is a place where the devil goes about like a roaring lion seeking whom he may devour, where he leaves his victims' entrails hanging on to barbed wire, and where the bodies of your friends and mine lie decomposing in muddy holes. You know the place?" I put my legs across the colonel's horse, which was in the wagon lines, and set forth for Amiens. That horse knew that I had pinched him, forgive my slang. I should have said it in the French language, vole, and resented me. Thrice was I nearly thrown from his back. Twice did he entangle himself in barbed wire deliberately. Once did I have to coerce him with many stripes to pass a tank. Then the heavens opened upon us, and it rained. It rained until I was wet to the skin, in spite of sheltering beneath a tree, one branch of which, owing to the stubborn temper of my steed, struck me a stinging blow across the face. So in no joyful spirit, I came at last to Amiens, this whited sepulchre, this Circe's capital, this den of thieves, this home of vampires. There I dined, not wisely but too well. I drank of the flowing cup and bouteille de champagne, and I met a maiden as ugly as sin, but beautiful in my eyes after poesy, as you understand, and accompanied her to her poor lodging in a most verminous place. So where we discoursed upon the problems of life and love, or youth, or war, or hell. My horse, that brute, who resented me, was in charge of an ostler, whom I believe verily is a limb of Satan, in the yard without. It was late when I left that lair of Circe, where young British officers, even as myself, are turned into swine. It was late and dark, and I was drunk. Even now I am very drunk. I may say that I am becoming drunker and drunker. It was true. The fumes of bad champagne were working in the boy's brain, and he leaned heavily against me. It was then that happened which will undoubtedly lead to my undoing and blast my career as I have blasted my soul. The horse was there in the yard, but without saddle or bridle. "Where is my saddle, and where is my bridle, oh naughty ostler?" I shouted in dismay. "The ostler, who, as I informed you, is one of Satan's imps," answered in incomprehensible French, led the horse forth from the yard, and giving it a mighty blow on the rump, sent it clattering forth into the outer darkness. In my fear of losing it, for I must be at Posieres at dawn, I ran after it, but it ran too fast in the darkness, and I stopped and tried to grope my way back to the stable-yard to kill that ostler, thereby serving God and other British officers, for he was the devil's agent. But I could not find the yard again. It had disappeared. It was swallowed up in Cimmerian gloom. So I was without revenge and without horse, and as you will perceive, sir, unless you are a bloody staff officer who doesn't perceive anything, I am utterly undone. I am also horribly drunk, and I must apologize for leaning so heavily on your arm. It's awfully good of you. Anyway, old man." The crowd was mostly moving, driven indoors by the rain. The woman who had spoken to me said, "I heard a horse's hoofs upon the bridge, the bass." Then she went away with her apron over her head. Thomas and I walked each side of the officer, giving him an arm. He could not walk straight, and his legs played freakish tricks with him. All the while he talked in a strain of high comedy interlarded with grim little phrases, revealing an underlying sense of tragedy and despair, until his speech thickened and he became less fluent. We spent a fantastic hour searching for his horse. It was like a nightmare in the darkness and rain. Every now and then we heard distinctly the clip-clop of a horse's hoofs, and went off in that direction, only to be baffled by dead silence, with no sign of the animal. Then again, as we stood listening, we heard the beat of hoofs on hard pavements in the opposite direction, and walked that way, dragging the boy, who was getting more and more incapable of walking upright. At last we gave up hope of finding the horse, though the young officer kept assuring us that he must find it at all costs. "It's a point of honor," he said thickly. "Not my horse, you know, doctor's horse. Devil to pay tomorrow." He laughed foolishly and said, "Always devil to pay in morning." We were soaked to the skin. "Come home with me," I said. "We can give you a shakedown." "Frightfully good, old man. Awfully sorry, you know, and all that. Are you a blooming general or something? But I must find horse." By some means we succeeded in persuading him that the chase was useless, and that it would be better for him to get into our billet and start out next morning early. We dragged him up the Rue des Augustins to the Rue Amiral Courbet. Outside the iron gates I spoke to him warningly. "You've got to be quiet. There are staff officers inside." "What, staff officers? Oh my God!" The boy was dismayed. The thought of facing staff officers almost sobered him, did indeed sober his brain for a moment, though not his legs. "It's all right," I said. "Go quietly and I will get you upstairs safely." It was astonishing how quietly he went, hanging on to me. The little colonel was reading the Times in the salon. We passed the open door and saw over the paper his high forehead puckered with perplexity as to the ways of the world. But he did not raise his head or drop the Times at the sound of our entry. I took the boy upstairs to my room and guided him inside. He said, "Thanks awfully," and then lay down on the floor and fell into so deep a sleep that I was scared and thought for a moment he might be dead. I went downstairs to chat with the little colonel and form an alibi in case of trouble. An hour later, when I went into my room, I found the boy still lying as I had left him, without having stirred a limb. He was a handsome fellow, with his head hanging limply across his right arm and a lock of damp hair falling across his forehead. I thought of a son of mine, who in a few years would be as old as he, and I prayed God mine might be spared this boy's tragedy. Through the night he slept in a drugged way, but just at dawn he woke up and stretched himself, with a queer little moan. Then he sat up and said, "Where am I?" "In a billet at Amiens. You lost your horse last night, and I brought you here." Remembrance came into his eyes, and his face was swept with a sudden flush of shame and agony. "Yes, I made a fool of myself. The worst possible. How can I get back to Pogiers?" "You could jump a lorry with luck." "I must. It's serious if I don't get back in time. In any case, the loss of that horse." He thought deeply for a moment, and I could see that his head was aching to the beat of sledge-hammers. "Can I wash anywhere?" I pointed to a jug and basin, and he said, "Thanks, enormously." He washed hurriedly, and then stared down with a shamed look at his muddy uniform, all creased and bedraggled. After that he asked if he could get out downstairs, and I told him the door was unlocked. He hesitated for a moment before leaving my room. "I am sorry to have given you all this trouble. It was very decent of you. Many thanks." The boy was a gentleman when sober. I wonder if he died at Pogiers or farther on by the Butte de Wallencourt. A week later I saw an advertisement in an Amiens paper: horse found, brown, with white sock on right foreleg. Apply. I have a fancy it was the horse for which we had searched in the rain.
This concludes the 11th part of 18 total of Now It Can Be Told by Philip Gibbs, produced by Best Audiobooks for free.